And joining us on the Western Hotline is Stephen Ruiz. Stephen, good morning.
Good morning. How you guys doing?
Good. Question for you on the Eagles. Like, we're here in Buffalo, Stephen, so we live our lives watching the Bills knock on the door, wonder when they're going to break through. I don't know if we're talking about the Bills reinventing the wheel every time, every year. Do you think there is something to be learned from the Eagles? Because, there are a lot of different ways to build a team. To me, the Eagles, what they did was they had a bunch of awesome players, and I know that's kind of simplistic. Is it more complex than that? Like, what is Philadelphia really built here besides just stacking talent?
It's not only that they have good players, it's where they have those good players or where they have their best players, and it's in the trenches. And I think Buffalo has started that process where they're going to be a team that could beat teams in the trenches. We saw that on the offensive side, at least this year. And I think Sean McDermott, after the season, kind of mentioned that. Like, you have to get better in the trenches. And I think looking at the Bills, how they can improve going into 2025, I think it's on the defensive line, and it's building something similar to what Philadelphia had. You saw how dominant that defensive line was in that game, and I thought it really made the difference in the result.
Yeah, the Bills have invested a lot of assets in edge, but not that much at tackle. And if there's anything that might change going forward, they've drafted 2 defensive tackles since 2019. It's Ed Oliver, and then nobody until this last year, Dwayne Carter. They've been a team that's kind of, felt like they can get by at defensive tackle, some free agent signings. For Philadelphia, that's a spot they have, of course, attacked very aggressively.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, interior defensive line, it helps you on early downs. It helps you in late downs. And I think that's what the Bills have to figure out, is how to get the defense rolling in both scenarios. I think last year they were really good on early downs, especially against the run. It's kind of counterintuitive because they are a lighter team. They play a lighter style of defense. They rarely come out of nickel. And you would assume that would help in passing situations, but they were worse in passing situations than they were in run situations. So I think that's the concern with Buffalo. And I really think you have to re-examine the base structure of your defense, because they have been hit hard by injuries over the last couple of years. That's why it's so hard for me to criticize Sean McDermott and the plays he's calling whenever the defense doesn't play well. But when you're asking lighter guys to go up against heavier guys, injuries are going to happen. So I think you got to kind of re-examine all that and take a step back and ask yourself, is this the right way to approach playing defense in this modern era of the NFL?
Stephen Ruiz with us on the Western Hotline. So is it a slam dunk for you, like it is for Bills fans, that they should just go pay whatever it costs for Myles Garrett? Is it that easy?
I mean, you can laugh and say, yeah, that's a simple approach. But when you look at the Eagles' approach to building their roster, I've always made this joke that Howie Roseman just goes after guys you've heard of. He drafts the big names, the guys that are higher on the consensus mock draft board. He sends a pick to the guys that you've heard of, or he trades a pick for guys that you've heard of that have had past success. I really think it comes down to stacking talent. And when you have known commodities, you just go for it. And maybe you overpay a couple times.
What would be an overpay for Garrett? What's the price? What do you think is appropriate? The Bills are in a unique spot where they're drafting 30th, so picks might not be as interesting to the Browns. I was doing draft value chart, adding it up, and the Bears offering the same picks is worth twice as much as the Bills. So I don't know. It feels like if the Bills were to get it done, it would feel like a package that looks like a lot, but maybe isn't as much.
Yeah, because I think he's that type of player. He's like a force multiplier where if you have him on your defensive line, the entire defensive line gets improved. So you are able to skimp at other positions, especially on defense. I think he's a player that makes your linebackers better. I think he's a player that makes your defensive tackle better. I think he's a player that makes your secondary better. He's one of those generational players, and I don't think you get overpaid for those guys because there are mechanisms in the salary cap where you can kind of work around that and fill in the gaps in other ways. When you have a player like Josh Allen on the other side who has that same impact on the offensive roster, I think you can afford to splurge on a player like Garrett.
Yeah. And, the thing about it the next kind of conversation about Allen here, Stephen, is trying to find the right mix of going as aggressively as the Bills can to try and get one versus staying competitive. They've stayed competitive. They've made some bold moves. They went for Von Miller, and last year was viewed as a year in transition. To me, it feels like this is the kind of time where pushing back in is the right idea.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the cap situation is a little tricky. I think they have a better cap situation when you're just looking at cap space, but I think their ability to make moves to open up more cap space is a little more restricted than it was last year when they were purging all these veterans from the roster. But I mean, we saw this year how close they were. What are they? They're one possession away from going to the Super Bowl, and I think they give Philly a much different game than Kansas City did. So I don't think you have to make drastic moves. You just have to make the right moves, and that's what you saw from Philadelphia last year, who was coming off a much worse year than the Bills are coming off this year.
You know, Stephen, we had a unique experience here in Buffalo. I'm glad you said they might have given Philly a different game. We were kind of conflicted between loving that the Chiefs got absolutely destroyed in that game, loved that, but also it left a feeling of, wait a minute, they were not some invincible force. The Bills maybe let them off the hook, the fact that they couldn't stop that offense when other teams did not have as much of a problem stopping it.
Yeah, that was my thought after the game, was like maybe we over-indexed how good the Chiefs offense looked against a Bills defense that had been pretty bad down the stretch, like going back to the Rams game where they just couldn't stop. A Rams offense that was good but not that great. But yeah, I just think the matchup would have been different. I think Buffalo would have been able to run the ball because they have a quarterback who impacts the run game. I think that's really where you see the difference between a quarterback like Josh Allen and a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes. As passers, I think Mahomes probably has a slight edge, even though I think they're probably pretty equal. But you're always going to have a good run game in Buffalo. It's the same with Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. As long as you have those guys representing an extra number the defense has to account for, you're going to have some open lanes in the run game. And I think they would have had more success if they wouldn't have been one-dimensional, which is really what did Kansas City in. They couldn't protect Patrick Mahomes because Philadelphia knew they were going to drop back and pass the football on almost every down.
Thinking about what you just said about the run game, we've been talking, Stephen, a lot today about James Cook because he's going into a contract year, and he posted on Instagram $15 million a year. His brother is posting about him getting $20. So we're trying to figure out like how good an idea that is, and it comes. You can even tie this into the Eagles if you want. I know Barkley wasn't great on Sunday, but how different should a running back conversation about a guy like James Cook or really anyone in the league sound today versus a year ago before Barkley and Henry and even Jacobs, if you want, went to new teams, big contracts, and it went pretty well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you have to consider the context of the team. I think if you have a passing game where you have playmakers who can consistently produce explosive plays, you don't really need that special running back who can turn a 4-yard gain into a 25-yard gain, right? But if you don't have those guys, and Buffalo has kind of been struggling to find that guy. You saw that with the trade for Amari Cooper, which didn't really work out, although he gave you a couple of splash plays when he first got there. I think you have to consider it. I think you have to consider maybe overpaying compared to market prices, a running back who can turn those 4-yard gains into 25-yard gains.
Stephen Ruiz with us on the Western Hotline. Going back to the Super Bowl on Sunday, I've been watching some of your Twitter stuff, and we've read you a lot over the years on Jalen Hurts. Is it driving you crazy? It's not maybe not happening everywhere, but
this is resultsism, right? Like,
yeah. Naturally, guy gets a ring, and some people are gonna want to elevate him probably to a place that he probably shouldn't be considered.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are forgetting that it was a 20-week season and not a 2-week season. But I have to give Jalen credit. Like the last 2 weeks, he played well. He played like his 2022 version of himself, which I don't think he had reached over the last 2 years. But when you put an average quarterback behind the best offensive line in football, or the second best line if you want to give props to Detroit, you give them maybe the best receiving duo in the NFL, give them a solid tight end, or a good tight end, Dallas Goedert, give them the number one defense. Yeah, if you don't win a ring, I got questions about you there. So, I just look at the tape. I look at his skill set. I see a player who's accurate, but not like Joe Burrow accurate. He's a factor in the run game, but we saw how many times he pulled it on his own read and got caught by a defensive end trying to get around the edge. And I don't think he's the fastest processor, which that offensive line really masked. So I think he's in the ideal situation for him, and that kind of exaggerates his skills as a quarterback. But I don't want to take anything away from him. He played well over the last 2 weeks, and he outplayed Patrick Mahomes, although that was a pretty low bar on Sunday night.
He made, obviously the Smith throw down the field, a couple to Brown. He made great throws. I wonder, I don't know how much of the film you've watched back yet, but even though Barkley got shut down, did his presence still kind of make it easier for Hurts? Like a lot of those situations where he nailed throws to Smith or Brown, it looked like it was one-on-one with, one of the top receivers in the league.
No, that was definitely the case. And if you go back to the first time those two teams played in the Super Bowl, that was the strategy from Spagnuolo. We're going to sell out against the run. We're going to defend the run with numbers. Like, if you watch that game, it's not like they're using standard run fronts. They're sending second-level guys. They're sending third-level guys, not as blitzers after the pass, but as run blitzers. And you have to punish those on the outside. And to his credit, Jalen Hurts made the throws. I thought he missed a couple throws. What you see with these quarterbacks in these ideal situations is they have a wider margin for error. They get out, like, yes, Jalen Hurts made a couple of special back shoulder throws in that game, but he also missed a number of them. The play before this, the pick, he has A.J. Brown with, like, 2 steps on his defender. You don't usually throw a back shoulder fade there, and for some reason Jalen Hurts decided to, and they missed on what would have been an easy touchdown. So I think that's the thing that people kind of ignore is the missed opportunities, and they don't consider the outtakes, if you will.
Stephen Ruiz of The Ringer, way too early prediction. Who's the class of the AFC next year? I mean, the Bills will have some questions. We've gone through those. The Chiefs, of course, will have some questions. Baltimore. Is Cincinnati back in the mix? Like, what do you see looking forward for the AFC?
I mean, I think Buffalo is primed to take a huge step. I think Buffalo and Baltimore, I really think next year is their time. I mean, I guess I've been saying that for a couple of years now, but the Chiefs are getting older. Kelsey isn't getting any younger. I think it's going to be harder to keep that defense where it was playing, as evidenced by this past season, where we saw them start out really hot, but then by the end of the year, they're around league average. And it's going to be hard to build up a roster around Patrick Mahomes when they poured money and other resources into positions that haven't necessarily paid off for them. Thinking about the wide receiver position and the offensive line position, or the offensive line group in particular.
All right. Stephen Ruiz. Stephen, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Stephen Ruiz, you can read him at theringer.com. Great website.